Good morning and welcome everybody to today's meeting. So move on to the first item of agenda. So I want to advise members that this meeting will be webcast for live or subsequent broadcast via the Council's meeting YouTube site, and that members of the press and public may record and take photographs except where they are confidential or exempt items. Apologies. I've had apologies from Councillor Aiken and Councillor Khan. Nazima, have we had any further apologies?
Yeah, I've received apologies on behalf of Councillor Griffin.
Thank you. And are there any other apologies? Anybody? Okay, so no further apologies. So we'll move on to the next item, which is declaration of interest. Does any members have any interest to declare? Okay, I see no one expressing any interest to declare. So we'll move on to the next item of the agenda. As today's meeting is an informal online meeting, the notes from the last meeting will be carried over to the next formal meeting. So we'll move on to our main item for discussion today, which is an issue that was raised by Councillor Morell. I'm just trying to have a look. I don't think he's with us yet. But yeah, it's an item that was raised by Councillor Morell. So I was hoping that he'd be here today to perhaps give members a bit of a steer on this. But in essence, sort of the concerns that were raised are something that the committee has considered previously, and that is the impact of the planning approvals and decisions on venues in areas where residential developments are being permitted on top of the pressure brought about by COVID. I'd like to welcome Maria Dunn, Head of Development Policy, and Julia Smithfield, Principal Planning Officer, to give us some further detail and run through the key points in the presentation that's been circulated. Maria, can I also ask that you update members on progress made since the consultation on the economic recovery strategy that the committee took part in last November? So I'll pass over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to share the presentation. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, I can see that, Maria.
Okay, thank you. So the presentation just briefly covers the current policy position, the general permitted development order and technical approach in relation to planning and noise. So in terms of national policy, the National Planning Practice Guide includes consideration of the sensitivity to the prevailing acoustic environment, and it states that good acoustic design needs to be considered early in the planning process. So essentially this is about considering the underlying noise within the area and how the building is designed. Requires plan making to take account of whether or not a significant effect is occurring or likely to occur, whether or not an adverse effect is occurring or likely to occur, and whether or not a good standard of amenity can be achieved. So when we are looking at plan making and allocating sites for development, we're required to consider the impact of noise from the development and on the development. And it sets out factors where noise will be a concern. And it also sets out how the risk of conflict between new development and existing businesses or facilities can be addressed. So that's those issues around bringing residential into areas that have background noise levels. So locally, we previously didn't have a policy around this. There was nothing specific in the Birmingham Development Plan, but we have been preparing development management policies in Birmingham development plan documents, so that will become a statutory planning document once it's adopted. And this document's due to be adopted later this year, and this will introduce a policy around noise and vibration. So policy DM6 requires development to be designed, managed and operated to reduce exposure to noise, and it requires background noise to be taken into account. It also requires that the development sensitive to noise must be accompanied by an assessment of the impact of any existing or planned sources of noise and vibration in the vicinity, and details of how any adverse noise will be reduced and mitigated. So for the first time, we'll have a local policy that is really clear around considering those levels of background noise and the impact of new noise sensitive development on existing facilities and operations within an area. So in terms of the general permitted development order and the changes to residential use under that, so these are ones changes of use that don't require a planning consent. The impact of noise from commercial premises is largely controlled through prior approval, but some PD rights exclude noise considerations. So there are some instances where we can't apply our policy because the planning application isn't required. Noise was not originally a consideration for offers to residential development, but it has been introduced, so that provides greater protection for businesses. And the GDPO talks about commercial noise. So, for example, traffic noise isn't in scope, but noise from business premises would be. There are subtitles in the drafting of the order, and most are defined as impacts of noise from commercial premises on intended occupiers, but also uses the phrase noise impacts of the development. So again, that takes into account both the noise from the development and the impact of noise on the development. And obviously the subsequent issues that we've seen arise in some instances where we've had development that's sensitive to noise. So in terms of the technical approach, where noise is in scope, the first stage is the provision by the applicants of a noise assessment. So this must have an appropriate methodology and it must scope noise that characterises the existing environment. The officer will ensure that all suitable noise sources are included and that they are representative. And an example here would be ensuring that a nearby factory was operating noisy equipment or a live music venue had an event on when any surveys were undertaken. So it's about really considering that, considering the operation of those premises and making sure that surveys are undertaken at an appropriate time, not a time, for example, where businesses wouldn't be generating that noise. So the impact of COVID and lockdown has complicated matters. We've obviously had a situation where businesses aren't operating normally, and therefore it's more difficult to look at those underlying noise considerations. So we have used historic data and data from other sites, and we've provided information to bridge the gap where facilities aren't operating at those times. So the impact is then tested against the development proposals, bearing in mind the layout and construction details, and where feasible non-habitable rooms are located in the noise affected parts of the scheme. There are three potential outcomes. The noise is incapable of mitigation, that with mitigation a suitable residential environment can be created, and that the existing situation is suitable for residential use. So they're the considerations that need to be taken into account when we're looking at the impact of noise on residential use. Where mitigation is necessary, this can take the form of the specification of the external fabric of the building. So, for example, how walls are constructed or how the building is glazed. In the worst case, having non-opening windows in residential properties and providing an alternative means of ventilation. Ceiling of windows is not considered to be an optimum solution, and it's not supported by all regulatory services. Therefore, it would put the planning balance, be put into the planning balance of the overall scheme. Where mitigation at source is feasible without placing unreasonable constraints on the business and both parties agree to the scope of these works, the developer can provide funding or undertake works to the affected business. Obviously, this has to be a mutual agreement, and then the application can be determined with the benefit from the changes. And a recent example of this strategy is at 16 Kent Street, where works proposed to mitigate the impact of the Nightingale nightclub in the heart of the gay village. There are disadvantages to dealing with noise at source. The process of negotiations to agree and test the scope of the works can take a long time. The cost of the works to the developer can reduce other planning gains, for example, affordable housing or public open space contributions. And the scope of the work will only be mitigated for that specific development, and other schemes may necessitate further works. So, for example, further impact on the same business. So that's the presentation in terms of what we pulled together for planning and noise. The economic recovery strategy, we are looking at setting up an economic recovery partnership to continue to monitor the schemes that were set out in the appendix to that economic recovery strategy. There is a lot of work ongoing around all of those projects, and we'll be looking at pulling together a monitoring report to set out progress since it was adopted. And the economic recovery partnership will essentially be a continuation of the business recovery cell, which has been operating for probably since March 2020 to address the economic impact of COVID. The group, it's felt, needs to move to a longer term view and a recovery moving to new business as normal point of view. So not dealing with the immediate short term implications of COVID, but looking at that longer term recovery. The first meeting of that group will be taking place before Christmas, and then it's anticipated that meetings will be diarised monthly, but subject to demand from agenda items. So with meetings being in monthly but cancelled if they're not needed. Thank you.
Maria, is Julia doing a separate presentation, or do you want to take questions now, and then Julia comes in after the questions?
Do you want me to provide some additional flesh on the bones, as it were, with regards to noise? I can explain in more detail an example that's happening in the city centre, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so Julie, if you come in now, then we'll take questions after.
Okay, just to introduce myself, I'm Julia Summerfield. I'm a Principal Planning Officer in the City Centre Planning Management Team. I'm one of the officers that determines planning applications and brings larger scale planning applications to Planning Committee. Just to add a bit more detail on what Maria has already said, we do have specific guidance from regulatory services called Planning Consultation Guidance Note on Noise and Vibration. And I'm just going to share my screen. And that's a specific guidance note that is available on our website, and it is intended to provide guidance to regulatory services officers when reviewing planning applications and making recommendations to Planning Committee. It also assists those making planning applications by drawing attention to noise and vibration issues that need to be addressed. It gives specific guidance on what noise surveys should cover, how long the monitoring should be set up for, how the noise should be monitored, where from, specific details like that, just to help applicants when they're putting planning applications together. And this is quite a controversial subject, particularly in the city centre when we have late night uses quite close to residential developments. At the moment, we have specific issues around Her Street and Southside, and also in Digbeth. And just to show you an example of one such matter we have in the city centre, I'm going to show you a plan of Her Street and its surrounds. So, for example, this is the Nightingale Club here in the centre. All these other areas that are coloured here are approved planning applications that incorporate residential development. And we also have 3 current applications in this lilac colour here, the yellow and the red, which again are for residential proposals in close proximity to the Nightingale. And we can't forget there are other late night uses in the area, such as the Fox, the Loft, Sidewalk, Missing. There are a whole host of late night commercial uses within the vicinity. So we have to try and consider what the impact will be upon late night uses. National guidance says that existing businesses and facilities should not have unreasonable restrictions placed on them as a result of development permitted after they were established. As Maria referred to previously, the best case scenario is to reduce the noise at source. And we have a current application, it's awaiting a Section 106 agreement at 16 Kent Street, where we are resolving the issue by an agent of change agreement, which will provide soundproofing to the Nightingale Club. So effectively, the development here will be paying for alterations to the nightclub to soundproof it, to make the impact upon the residential amenity reduced, and therefore hopefully avoid any complaints from residential occupiers in the future, which may have an impact on how the club operates. In terms of the Nightingale, it's been estimated that the cost of works will amount to some £661,000, and such works will comprise treating the smoking area, acoustically treating it, additional mitigation to the walls, providing a new smoking area but away from residential properties, the closure of the first and second floor balconies, and mitigation to the windows within the building. And it is anticipated that by requiring these works, as I say, there will be less impact upon the surrounding developments. This one here at 16 Kent Street is the closest in terms of timescale of being implemented. However, should something happen and this one comes forward first, maybe, or this one here, then it's anticipated that either of these developments would be able to pay for the works to the Nightingale Club. In other circumstances, as I say, the agent of change in actually soundproofing the source of the noise is the preferred approach. However, when agreement cannot be reached with the late night use in this instance, then we have to go down a hierarchy of alternatives, such as trying to amend the layout of a particular development, putting those less habitable rooms closest to the source of noise, or if worse comes to worse, and as said previously, we have to seal windows of the apartments. This is not the preferred approach. It's not the preferred living conditions for those future occupiers. However, at the back of our minds, we always have to acknowledge that we don't want to have an effect on the business and their operations. And so this is the only way that we can regenerate sites in the city centre, but at the same time provide a situation where late night uses can sit cheek by jowl with residential uses. So that's a bit more of how it has worked in practice and how it is working. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Julia. So I know Councillor Cornish, you had your hands raised. So if you want to ask a question, if anyone else would like to ask a question, if you can raise your hands virtually, and I'll take you turn by turn. So over to you, Councillor Cornish.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, first of all, I'm disappointed that Councillor Morell hasn't joined us this morning, simply because this is a subject very close to his heart. He's very much wanted to discuss it. However, moving forward on that, having been on Planning Committee for 15 years now, I have to say we've come across huge problems with a scenario such as this. Development within the areas of nightlife have resulted over the years in huge problems for the established venues in the entertainment area. Some being forced to close. The noise and vibration designed to alleviate this is essential. However, on numerous occasions, it has not been enough. I'm really pleased to hear what has just been said about the Nightingale and the soundproofing of, it's quite a large amount of 661k being paid for soundproof. That actually is something that could be a huge benefit for an awful lot of venues. However, it'll all depend on whether the agreement can be made that the developer is prepared to do so, because we do want to develop all the areas, we know that, but at the expense of so many areas within the entertainment area. And as far as that is concerned, they've been very hard hit, we know, through lockdown. But aside from that, they were always very hard hit when we have these developments there going forward. The companies are not always obliged to do this, as we know. And where my brain has gone over the years when we've come across these problems, we've had it in Broad Street, everywhere really, going back over years. And some of them, well, yes, hotels and everything have gone up close to very popular venues that have had to close. All of this is great. And I do hope that we can move forward. And as I said earlier, I'm glad that this possibility of the developers, perhaps all of them, can be encouraged to go forward with paying for the actual venues that are making the noise, which they're entitled to do. That is their business. The biggest problem has been is that it is not a planning issue normally, or never used to be. Hopefully it can be, that unless we can actually move forward to discuss that the solutions for the applicants and those that are selling these apartments on, that perhaps the discussion could be entertained on for future purchasers within that development, which is difficult because it can be companies buying a whole batch or an individual buying a department. But I think it should be made clear at that point, when they're signing their contract of purchasing, that you are in the middle of an entertainment area. This is what will happen. And these are the conditions we have here. And we will not be making any changes to that. In other words, you're moving into an entertainment area, you're going to make a lot of noise. And we presume you're moving in there because that's what you want. I think it's very unfair when they come back, when they're being disturbed. It's unfair that they're being disturbed. We know that. If we can alleviate that, yes, that's good. But it's not always possible. So I think that is also something I would like to see some discussions taking place, that perhaps it's not at the moment planning decisions, but perhaps we could actually think about doing something like that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Julia, I see that you have your hand raised. I don't know if you want to respond to that now before I take the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor, you're absolutely right. If we could resolve all these noise issues at source and with the entertainment premises, that would be our first preference. But as said previously, and as you alluded to, not all entertainment venues want to negotiate, want to make changes. And it obviously has to be an agreement between the developer and the premises owner. And also it can become more complicated when it's not just one premises, it's a whole series of premises that need to be involved in an agreement or regarding an agent of change. So that is difficult, and you're quite right. With respect to an issue of buyer beware, again, you're right. It would be lovely to think that people are aware of the noise and the potential nuisance when they're buying a property. And certainly you would hope that developers would make occupiers aware and that the purchasers think about their property before purchasing or renting. However, whilst best efforts can be made, regulatory services obviously cannot avoid or not act on a complaint that is submitted. So we can't stop people making complaints about noise, and then regulatory services have to act on those complaints, which, as you've referred to, can lead to statutory nuisance complaints and require premises to make alterations. So again, it would be lovely in an ideal world that people would know what they're buying into, but unfortunately it doesn't always happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Councillor Lal.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Maria and Julie is, do we have any remedy post planning approvals? For example, in the Julie Quarter, in your street, there was a residential block, beautiful house, I think, and the residents were promised when they signed for lease or rent that they're going to have a gym there on the ground floor. Instead of the gym, it turned out the Tesco Express opened up, giving noise and vibration to the first floor residents. Now, this has been dragging on for so long that they are complaining and that they somehow it's not being resolved. So do we have any remedy for residents who find themselves in a situation which they didn't envisage when they bought the lease or rented the property? There's something going to come cause nuisance to them. And as I say, it's a very, very long, windy process to deal with this. Is there any way we can find an effective and quick way of helping the residents in that situation? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Maria, are you able to, or Julie, are you able to answer that question, either one of you?
Yes, Councillor. In terms of planning, providing the development is meeting the requirements of the planning consent, i.e. they have planning, the benefit of planning consent for a Tesco Express, then there would be nothing we could do about that. The swift way of resolving this issue is for the occupiers to make a complaint to regulatory services, and they will ascertain whether there is a sufficient nuisance for them to take action. If there isn't, then it would have to be between them and whoever they lease the property of. But in terms of planning, providing they're meeting their planning consent and the conditions attached to their decision notice, then there would be no further action that the planning department could take.
If I come back,
yep.
When that block, railway block was built, and they had the planning approval, it wasn't enough there that there will be a retail use. There'll be a supermarket opening on the ground floor. It wasn't in the regional plans. So there's a change of use which caused the problem. So I think when there's a change of use application, do the planning have the same requirement on the noise and vibration part?
There are permitted development rights, and I would need to check, Councillor, whether there are such rights to change a gym to a retail use. And it may be that the original planning consent approved a range of uses. I'm just not sure without knowing the ins and outs of this particular case. By all means, you can contact me with the address and I can follow it up for you. And maybe if it's applicable, I can get enforcement involved. But I would say that you will get a swifter response from regulatory services as they have more legislation that bites better than planning. So that would get, I think, a swifter response.
Thank you, Julia. Councillor Cornish, you have your hand raised again.
No, I don't think I do. Not on my computer anyway.
Oh, I think it might have been from previously. So does anybody else have any further questions that they'd like to ask?
Can I ask Maria a question now on regulatory services?
Yes, of course.
This is said with respect. I will make a point of saying that at this stage. But I have had a situation within my ward recently on a development that, yes, has got permission and is moving forward. One of those moving forward, rebuilding a brick at a time. So those are always very difficult to handle. However, after various complaints from local residents living close by and having gone to take a look at this, my first instance was regulatory services needed to be involved, of which I went forward to do so, as well as looking at enforcement, and all of that has been done, and I would like to thank them all for the support they've given me with doing that. However, what I found that I have to say I'd either missed it, which is always possible, there's so much going on with planning, but my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the applicant can actually look towards getting their own companies that they choose on checking on regulatory services. First of all, is that correct? Secondly, if it's done via the planning application at the time, then some of those are outsourced. And when you contact them, which I tried in a couple of instances, it was very difficult to actually get any response or to get them actually involved on wanting to go and take a look to see what happens. Initially, that's what happened to me. I did resolve it, I said, by where enforcement had gone in and taken over again. But can you just clarify exactly how business regulation does work within an application, please?
Julia?
Yeah, so I wasn't sure if Julia wanted to come in.
Yeah. Yes, Councillor. On any application that we think there may be regulatory services input required, we consult them, but they don't only just come back to us with respect to noise, they also comment on air quality and contaminated land. But like other consultees, they are given 21 days to respond to the planning application, no matter how small or large. And the larger schemes can have a whole host of documents that accompany them with respect to noise, as I say, contaminated land, air quality. And as far as I'm aware, though those consultations are not outsourced in any way. They have a team of environmental health or regulatory services officers. They have their own patches within the administrative area, so they're divided up, and each officer will respond to the relevant consultation. Does that respond adequately to your query?
Partially, yes. I'm still actually having to keep my finger on the button with this particular one to see where we go. But it could well have been perhaps it should have remained either with a highway section or enforcement anyway, which both are involved and given the support required. Perhaps I hadn't looked into exactly what building regulations could do. I mean, when you have residents that really know it's such a lot in planning to understand and not always obvious to know what you should be looking for and who you actually go forward to if there's a problem. I mean, as an example, some of them are very concerned on the health and safety issue on this particular property when they were removing the roof and you got no scaffolding up, and they were worried in case somebody was injured and nobody could see what had happened because you couldn't see what was going on. The other is that somewhere is perhaps not boarded up sufficiently so that all that's taking place on the land that they're entitled to use is not quite so visible to everyone else. But anyway, if you can add any more, that'd be good. But if not, thank you very much.
Councillor, I'm aware in respect to noise complaints that those can be submitted online, and then I would hope that a general inbox would allocate those to the relevant officer. I'm not sure with respect to other complaints, but certainly that would be my starting point, or otherwise I can give you the name of the Regulatory Services Manager, who would then be able to advise you further on who the complaint is with.
Oh, thank you. That would be very good. If you could email that to me sometime, that would be lovely.
Okay.
Thank you for your help.
Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, do we have any further questions for Julia or Maria?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Councillor Morel.
Hello, good morning. Yes, apologies for my lateness. I thought this was at 2 o'clock. I didn't realise it was 10 o'clock in the morning. Bit embarrassing considering it was me who wanted to bring this to debate. So I don't know what I've missed yet.
Okay, I'm glad that you could join us. We were saying that it's a shame that we didn't have you, seeing as this was something that you were quite passionate about. So I'm glad that you could join us. I don't know whether Maria, whether you could just give like a brief overview of what we sort of discussed, just for Councillor Morel.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So essentially, we've gone through the presentation that was shared, and we've looked at the policies in place around planning and noise. And I think worth drawing attention to the policy in the development management in Birmingham DPD, which is due to come before members for adoption later this year. So it will be presented to November Cabinet and then go on to full council. And that's a new policy, so that strengthens our position. And then Julia Summerfield, who's a development management officer in the city centre, has gone through some examples of how we've dealt with noise practically, specifically one example relating to the Nightingale Club, where an applicant is going to pay for works to the Nightingale Club to reduce the noise at source, and therefore come up with an acceptable solution for both the applicant and the Nightingale Club as a source of noise in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Councillor Morel, is there anything in particular that you'd like to ask Maria or Julia?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason we've brought this forward is because I used to sit on the planning committee, and we have, as you're probably aware, have got so many developments in Birmingham city centre in particular that are having an impact on the nighttime economy in particular. So to give you an example, Digbeth comes up time and time again, where we've had lots of properties being built right next to or adjacent nighttime venues, in particular the Mill. There was one really high profile case of the Clary's pub, where they actually came and did their own noise assessment, and their own independent noise assessment contradicted what the Birmingham City Council's noise assessment did. And that was quite an interesting case, because the property that was the development that was being built opposite them, we made the argument that had the side of the development that backed onto the pub, had that just been commercial space, no one would have had an objection. But the fact that they were just cramming so many properties into this development and had frankly no disregard for the pub and, you know, their licensing agreements and their opening hours. And originally it was rejected, but then they came back to the planning committee with fancy lawyers and made even more arguments about apparently noise mitigation and, you know, stuff like they're going to have, you know, air conditioning, which again, it just doesn't. If you know the nighttime economy, these are ridiculous arguments, because it's not just the noise. You're going to have the taxis outside and the footfall and all the rest of it. But anyway, because of the lawyers, the officers of the council got spooked and basically told us councillors that if we do not approve this, we will not be able to win in a court when it goes to appeal, and therefore the city council is going to get costs. And then what happened is all the Labour councillors buckled and it went through. And I mean, that was one of the last times that I was on the planning committee, because after that I came off it, and that was when I said, right, I spoke to Maureen about this, we have absolutely got to do something about this on economy and skills, because to me that shows that our Birmingham development plan is nowhere near strong enough. If our officers are telling us that our decision means nothing because they'll just go to a court of law, win an appeal, and then the city council is going to get fined. So that's why I think that we really do need to look at this, because I think if you look at the Cleary's case, for me, that was the final straw for me, that something, it is a bit of a scandal. And, but if we don't do something about this, then in a few years' time, there won't be any nighttime economy left in the city centre, and we'll just be building properties everywhere, and we're destroying what used to be a very vibrant city, really, when it came to the nighttime. So yeah, so that's basically why we wanted to bring this forward.
Thank you, Councillor Morell. Maria or Julia, either of you able to respond to that, please?
Yeah, Councillor Morell, hello, it's Julia Summerfield here. I think from the outset we have to acknowledge that the Birmingham Development Plan, particularly within the city centre, says that the city centre will act as a focus for retail, office and residential development. So we have to acknowledge that the city centre will continue, and we will encourage residential development, particularly as we have a housing need. However, I'm not familiar with the case that you refer to, but I know the location and I'm aware of the Cleary's pub. And I think if I recall correctly, we came to a solution whereby some of the apartments to that proposed residential development would be sealed in order to mitigate from the noise from the pub opposite. And as I've explained previously to the other councillors, the first preference is to address the noise at the source of the noise. So ideally, we would have liked to have mitigated the noise at the actual pub. But again, to reiterate, this requires the developers and the owners of the pub to come to an agreement, and that isn't always possible. And I can only assume it wasn't possible in this respect and in this case. Therefore, we have to work down a hierarchy of what can we do to mitigate, and will it be sufficient? The next level of mitigation is providing better glazing, providing a better facade to the development, again, to reduce the impact of noise from the pub. But I can only assume that in this instance, even that form of mitigation wouldn't have been sufficient, and therefore we go to our, you might say, bottom of the pile mitigation, which is sealed windows, which we don't like to do, but in order to avoid restrictions on the pub and in order to hopefully avoid future occupiers of that residential development submitting complaints about noise from the pub, this is the last resort that we have to accept. And as I recall, in this instance, some of the apartments, I can only assume at the front of the development facing the pub, would be sealed in order to allow the development to go ahead. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Julia. Councillor Morell, you have your hand raised again.
Thank you. I mean, thanks for that, Julia. But I mean, it kind of encapsulates my point. You know, as an officer, you're telling us what we want to hear, because it's like it should just be common sense that you don't build properties next to a pub. You know, and I've got a link for the article, but I don't. I'll try and post it into the chat. But you know, it's not just about the noise, is it? It's about, you know, if that pub wanted to open its license until 3 o'clock in the morning, or if it wanted to expand its operations, it's not going to be able to do that now because it's got residential properties right next to it. And so when it applies for a license, the residents, doesn't matter whether the windows are sealed or not, they legally can put an objection into that, which will have a direct impact on that business. And that's the point. we shouldn't be building properties right next to pubs. And if we look at the Mill, for example, we're converting the bus centre into a massive development there as well. And I don't really think there was much real consideration put there for the operations of the Mill either. And you just think this is just, for me, Chloe's was the final straw, because that just made me realise that, okay, it doesn't matter what we say on planning committee, this stuff will always go ahead. And that's precisely why something needs to be done about this. And I'm not going to stop until something is done, because I just think, I'm all for development, by the way. I'm not against property development. I'm certainly not against the redevelopment of Digbeth. You'll know there's been stuff on planning that I have voted for. In fact, I voted for a development literally only down the road from the one at Clary's. It's just a fact that there are some of them where you just think the noise assessments and the proposed solutions to those issues, for me, just seem a little bit. How do I say this? I just think it needs reassessment. And I often feel like officers are making their decisions not based on common sense. They're making the decisions because they're scared of costs at courts later down the line. And I think the way you prevent that is basically just make sure our Birmingham development plan is absolutely solid. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Moran. Before I ask Julia Maria to come in, I think, I just want to say in terms of like development, Councillor Morale, you were saying about having residential homes near pubs. I mean, from my experience, especially in my ward, I can speak from there. We have several, pubs that very, coexist within residential settings really well. And I think in terms of, because of the COVID pandemic, we've seen a lot of change in the way businesses are operating. They've had to adapt and change, whether it's in our local high streets, whether it's in the city centre. And I think it's kind of like trying to find that happy sort of medium where we can sort of where we have residential sort of developments coexisting alongside our existing businesses. So it is important that we can try and achieve that. Maria, Julia, I don't know if either of you want to come back in at this point.
Yes, Chair, just to, reiterate that it's going to be very difficult to avoid residential developments close to late night venues, particularly in the city centre, because, as I say, that's where the focus is for entertainment uses. And we have a lot of planning applications. There is a need for housing development in the city centre, and obviously developers think there is a market for such residential development. The impact on late night uses is not forgotten. It's foremost in our minds. We do not want such places to close, and then therefore we do all we can in terms of mitigating noise and allowing these developments to sit within close proximity to each other so that we have a vibrant city centre both in the day and the evening. It's not something that can be avoided. It's a planning consideration, and you're right to be concerned, but obviously each case is on its merits, and we consider each case individually and the mitigation for each case individually, which may differ depending upon the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And as I was trying to say before, it's again like with the developments that we're seeing in local centres as well, where we have this cafe culture developing and lots of entertainment, hospitality sector are boosting in our local centres as well. And it's about trying to find that happy medium where we can where businesses can coexist within residential settings, and they have done in the past quite well. Councillor Cornish, I think you had your hand up first.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Well, I spoke a little earlier, and I think I made my point at that stage. But going back to what Councillor Morell said recently on one particular area, which quite often is what I would call the elephant in the room. Yes, we have development. Yes, we have businesses. The nightlife is extremely important, and we need to move forward with that as soon as possible, particularly from the hard times we've had during lockdown. However, I did say a number of years ago, as I said earlier, 15 years on this, I've come across everything over the years that has created a problem, and even more so with all the huge development that's going on in the city, which we know we need to do that also. However, what I did put forward many years ago is the fact that there should be more finance available in planning or enforcement to feel free for us to go to an appeal. If that's what we feel on committee, we should have the opportunity to be able to say, we don't want this, regardless of what we're being told. I mean, yes, we do follow all the regulations. We are sensible enough to know what is right and what is wrong. But we also have a gut feeling, like I said earlier, there's been so many businesses, Broad Street, everywhere go back in years, by where they've had to close down because of complaints that do happen in the future, regardless of what mitigation we put in for everyone. So we would like, perhaps, as I said earlier, perhaps funding is available for council to run the risk of going to appeal. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cornish. Julie, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yes, Chair, just to say, councillors do have the opportunity to refuse, and officers will always give their considered opinion about whether the refusal reason is robust. Each case on its merits, as I say, but there's always the opportunity to refuse if councillors so wish.
Yeah, and from my experience of planning, you know, you do have that opportunity to, obviously the decision is yours. Obviously, officers present their report. You know, I'm on the planning committee as well, and it's down to councillors to make an assessment and judgment on which way they want on an application. Councillor Morell.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so just come back on a few points that have been made. I understand that there is a market for property development, and we also need to understand what's driving that. A lot of it is obviously demand for housing, a brownfield first policy, and HS2. HS2 is driving that, especially in the big buff economy. A point was raised about there are pubs that out in the city that work alongside residential, and totally I understand that, but my grief is really with the city centre. Julia and Maureen will tell you on planning, I often keep repeating the phrase that the city centre should be a safe space for the nighttime economy. And in particular, the gay village, which has also had this problem, the gay village is a safe space, full stop. And out of interest, I'm going to ask you a question. Can you, Julia, give me any examples of a planning application that has been refused based on noise concerns? Have we actually ever refused an application based on noise solely?
Councillor, yes, we did. It's called the Unitary and Armouries site, which is to the rear of the Nightingale, and that was taken to public inquiry and we lost.
Interesting. Was that the Amusement 13, was it? Was that at the back of, right, was that the one right opposite Nightingale's?
It's to the rear of Nightingale, so it fronts onto Bromsgrove Street. Yeah,
I remember that one. That came back, didn't it? And I remember we refused that, and again it was on the same grounds.
No, I mean the actual application is going back some years, and they've extended the time period to implement it. But the original consent, yes, was refused and went to public inquiry.
Right. Okay. What happened at the public inquiry?
Before my time, all I know is that we lost the appeal.
Okay. Right, interesting. Any more examples?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Does anyone else have any further questions? Okay, I can't see anyone else. I can't see anyone else indicating that they have any further questions. Okay, Councillor Lal.
I mean, my own experience is that, particularly during the quarter, I think our planning policy or planners are seem to be, in a way, favoring the developers or on the developer interest more than the residents' interest. So I don't know whether our policy is fit for purpose or it needs updating. I think that there is appear to me presumption is always from planners that it's going to go through if you refuse. So I think there'll be some sort of hope and protection for the interest of the area and for the neighbourhood and the residents. I mean, this is what I find. I mean, most of the planners applying in the Julie quarter, they seem to be, regardless of what the local views are, they always go through. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. Julia, I don't know if you want to respond to that, please.
I would only add that there is the opportunity for residents, members of the public, to come and address planning committee personally. So as a councillor, I would always advise residents to submit not only written objections to planning applications, but also take the opportunity to come and speak at a planning committee so that councillors are fully aware of the picture and the residents' concerns.
No respect, Maria, but see the developers, they with their financial might and the resources they can put up. Doesn't matter what residents say at the planning committee, they always win. This is what I mean. All the major applications, despite the residents taking up the opportunity to speak at the planning committee, it's sort of the developers always win because they got the upper hand.
Sorry, Julia, I don't know if you want to come back in a minute.
No, there's nothing to add to what I've said previously. Obviously, officers make recommendations on each and every planning application that is reported to planning committee, and during the meeting, it's for councillors to raise queries or raise issues and even refuse at that point. I can't really comment any further.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Do we have any further questions before we move on? No, I can't see anyone.
Sorry, my hand button didn't work then.
Yeah, Councillor Morrell.
Yeah, so I'm just going through the Cleary's case because I mean they came to planning themselves, just as Julia said, and opposed this many times, and they actually, as again, they brought their own independent noise assessment, which again contradicted what the council's own assessment did. And I think moving forward, what I would like to see actually is a public inquiry where we actually speak to people from the nighttime economy and bring them above to planning committee so they can actually talk about their own experiences. So rather than it actually being hypothetical, we've actually got people who can say, look, the planning decision made decision X, and as a result, I'm now getting affected by Y. And that way we've actually got tangible proof that it clearly has had an effect and therefore action should be taken. That might be something to consider next year I mean, I've said before, I'm more than happy to reach out to as many people as possible and get them to do that. The council could advertise that. And I think, you know, going over the Christmas period now, the nighttime economy is reopened post-COVID. So they're obviously now finding their feet again. They're trying to establish their businesses back up and making them thrive. And I think some of them are going to be in for a bit of a shock to see that there are now big developments happening right opposite them when during COVID they didn't happen. And that's also another point as well, is there were some noise assessments that were being done, I felt, that weren't really adequate enough because the businesses weren't really in full operation. And then sometimes they would say, oh, this is what the noise assessment was like pre-COVID. And it was like, yeah, but we still don't know what that business is going to be like in future, because again, a business might want to grow, and it's very difficult for a business to grow if they now have to deal with residents. The other point as well is there needs to be more joined up working. I think somebody raised this point previously, I'm not sure on what committee or whether it was in a group or a council, more joined up working between the licensing department and planning department, because I think, you know, decisions that are made on planning and licensing both affect one another. And it just feels like, you know, they both just do their own thing with no real consideration. And in particular, when it comes to licensing, environmental health and the noise assessments and all the rest of it. So I'm happy we've had this debate today. It's only the start though, and I'm sure, as Julia and Maureen will know, when I was on planning, I was extremely passionate about this, and I'm not going to stop talking about it, because I do. Nighttime economy is really important. It's a very important part of the economy and of Birmingham, and we should do everything we can to try and protect that, as well as support development. Again, this is not. I'm not anti-development. I'm not anti-regeneration. I just think it needs to be done in a proportionate way that is win-win for everyone. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Morell. Julia, I don't know if you want to make a final comment.
No, nothing further, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you both, Maria and Julia. You know, thank you on behalf of the committee for coming and providing these reports. So thank you very much. We are now going to move on to the next.
I think Councillor Cornish has got a hand up.
Councillor Cornish, do you have your hand raised? No? Councillor Cornish, did you want to ask a question? Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right, I think that might be from previously, Councillor Morell, that the hand was raised. Okay. So we'll move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the work programme. Our next meeting in December is the consideration of the impact of the clean air zone on businesses. And in January, we'll be welcoming Councillor Francis to give an update on her portfolio in relation to skills issues. So if members have anything they are keen for Councillor Francis to provide further or specific details on, can you let either myself or Basima know? And feel free to send an email and just let us know what it is, any specifics that you'd like her to bring. Can I also ask members to consider future items for consideration, specifically for February and March? Again, have a think and let us know if there's anything that you'd like us to consider for the future items. And as this is an informal meeting today, I'll skip the formal items on the agenda and move on to item 8, which is any other urgent business. Do you have any other urgent business? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you all at our next meeting, which is on the 8th of December.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julia, as well, for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.